Live. Hello. Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for very, very many reasons. This is just an open conversation. I'm here for an hour or so every Monday at 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Central Time. I am keeping an eye on the chat, and I am doing my best to talk about things that I think would be of interest to you all who are here watching, and doing my best to talk about them in ways that I think will be useful and accessible for you. For those of you, hi, one of you already has. For those of you who are willing and able to to write things in the chat, I'll see your messages, and that makes it a lot more likely that I will understand or come closer to understanding what you're actually interested in and how to communicate well with you. So I appreciate that. I work with a private therapy practice called Effective Artistry. Our offices are located in Northbrook, Illinois. We do individual, couples, and family therapy with people in the state of Illinois. Soon to be doing group therapy that I'll keep everyone updated on as that moves forward. We also work with a couple of executive functioning coaches who can work with people all over the world via the internet. One of the many reasons this isn't therapy is that it is public, as you are aware. You're here watching it via the internet, as could anyone else be. So please participate in the chat, and also just want to make sure you keep in mind that it is public, so you don't want to put anything in there that you would be unhappy for people to be able to see connected to the username that you're using as you put that stuff in. I think that's the basics, the gist of it. It's good to be with you all. Hello, everybody. I start off usually by talking about whatever I'm talking about, but like any conversation, we'll go where we go. Your questions, your thoughts, whatever you say will impact me and where I go. And I know that we had a question last week about the use of art in therapy. And I think that you're the Mimi, the Evie. I believe you're the person who asked about that last week and talked about potentially talking about it more today, which I'm happy to do. So I'll start off by just saying real answers to questions have to be exactly as specific as the question itself is, right? That if someone asks a generic question, the only answer to that question is a generic one. Oftentimes in practical conversations, what we're relying on is that I can ask a general question and the other person can interpret that to realize what is the specific question that I really want an answer to and answer that, or vice versa. But I try not to, especially in a public forum like this, I try not to do that. So can you put in the chat for me a question specifically about what you'd like to know about the use of art in therapy? And you don't have to. So one other thing to put out there is that there's a bit of a delay here. And so when I say something to you, there's like, I think 10 or 15 seconds before you hear it. And so whenever I say something to one of you specifically, how do you use art in therapy? There will be a delay. And so after I ask the question or make the statement to you, I'm just going to keep talking about stuff until that comes back, partly for the delay and partly because you're not obligated to put anything out there to respond to my question or respond to whatever it is that I'm saying. So I'll just keep going. How to use art in therapy. So this is, I like this question, and it's a fairly general one. So we'll start general, and as we go along, if I give you information that helps you to be able to narrow your question in more specifically, please do so. Because art is a few different things. So what is art is different from what are the particular forms of art. But generally what we're talking about, so there's creativity, which is just the ability to make new connections between things or to shorten connections between things. That if I've connected A to B to blah, 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 all the way on to Z, then I can find a way to just make it so that A connects directly to Z. That's a new connection, a shortened connection. Art is a particular format of expressing oneself, a particular way of communicating with others. So here's what I think of as a definition for art generally, what art generally is. And art is an attempt to communicate with a future unknown other. That if I'm creating some art, that I'm doing it with the idea in mind that there will be some audience for that art, whoever that might be. So the difference to me between writing like a poem that I think of as art versus journaling or writing a letter to somebody is about who I have in mind that I'm writing it to. If I'm writing something that I intend only for myself to see, that it could end up right that later on people are reading my journal. But if I'm writing it with the intention in mind that no one else will ever be reading it or observing it or interacting with it in any way, then I wouldn't call that art, which is it's not that art is good and things which are not art is bad. So that's not a saying it's not good enough to be art. I'm categorizing this. Things which are done only for myself and for nobody else is not art. And something that I do, like writing a letter to a particular person that I'm trying to communicate some specific thing to that person in some way, right? I have an intention of doing that. I also generally wouldn't call that art. There are many ways to use the word art that are all totally valid, and I'm not trying to counteract any of those, but this is the way I have found it to be most useful in these conversations generally to talk about it. So if I am making art, I'm doing something with the intention that somebody else or many other people will be able to observe it, interact with it, that it in some way is going to impact, be seen by, be experienced by other people at some point in the future without knowing specifically who those people are. Meaning I'm making something for an audience. That doesn't always have to be the general public at large, but some unknown person or group of people. Typically, I'm guessing, and you can help me understand, I'm guessing that that's not what you're talking about when you say, how do I use art in therapy? I'm guessing that what you're asking about is more art in the sense of like doing activities that fall under the category of particular forms of art. So for example, painting, right? That we culturally have painting as an art form. And that I think what you're asking about, if I'm guessing correctly, and if I'm not, please tell me, that you're saying like, how would we get brushes and paints and paper and do something, or draw, because that matches illustration, which is a form of art, or write poetry, or create music, write songs, or dance, various art forms are just particular constraints that we've put around, like things that fall into this category, behaviors of this type, we identify as being dance or music or one of the visual arts or acting or writing, whatever. Can you help me out and let me know if that's what you're asking about, like doing particular activities or exercises in therapy that fall under the category of what we'd say is a particular form of art? Sculpting, and I just made a whole thing about how I'll keep talking instead of waiting, and then it stopped and waited. Curious about the art activities. Yes. Okay. So that's going to vary person to person. And if you're asking me specifically, Brandon, what do I do? The only versions of activities or like what we're putting on the table is something that would be thought of as artistic. It falls into two categories. One is if I'm working with someone where they consider themselves an artist, not necessarily like a professional artist, but that art is a particular interest or a hobby or whatever, that it's meaningful to them in some particular way. Then art can come into the therapy in one of two ways. We can come back to that. I might need to take some notes for myself, which I don't usually do, but if I'm going to categorize things. The other way that it comes through is when I'm working with somebody who hasn't identified art or some form of art as a particular category of interest for them, is I'll bring in narrative art, sometimes writing specifically, but more storytelling. And a lot of that falls under or is like fairly close to, overlaps with a particular theory of therapy called narrative therapy. If if anyone here doesn't know, and I would assume that people generally don't, I certainly didn't before like going to graduate school to become a therapist. There are many different, you could call them schools of therapy, I guess, many different theories of therapy. Depending on which theory a therapist subscribes to, it influences how they see things, how they would categorize or label or identify things, how they would formulate what's going on, the problems, potential solutions, the actions that they take, the things that they do with clients. And one particular theory is called narrative. I do what's officially called eclectic therapy, which I would say is what probably most, I want to be more careful with my language. Many therapists either do adhere to one particular theory, in which case they will likely talk about that, right? That they're like a CBT therapist or an internal family systems therapist or something like that. Or if not, then everybody else mostly falls into what's called eclectic, which is you kind of take things from different theories. So I certainly use a lot of narrative stuff, but I wouldn't call myself a narrative therapist specifically. So when you're talking about the art activities, again, I'm guessing here, but you can tell me if you would like. I'm guessing that you're talking more about that first thing where like somebody, let's say I'm working with someone who is a painter. How do I utilize painting or things related to painting in the therapy? I'm guessing that's more what you mean rather than like, how do I use narrative and storytelling in therapy generally? So I'm going to assume that and start with that unless you tell me differently. I said before, when I'm working with someone for whom, oh, okay, cool. We'll do both then. When I'm working with someone for whom art is a particular thing that they put across, that they think of themselves as an artist, identify as an artist, that there's two different ways the art will come into the room. So one is, and we can start here, one is when the way in which they engage with their art is one of the things that they identify wanting to work on. Sometimes that's right up front. They know right off the bat, like one of the problems that I'm looking for help with in therapy is how to engage with my art in some different way. Sometimes it comes up later. They, come in for whatever reason. And as we're working through things at some point, for whatever reason, it comes up with like, I want to work on engaging with my art differently. A lot of the time that falls under the category of like, I want to work on my art more or more consistently, or following some kind of a pattern or going down some kind of a path that I've been wanting to do, but haven't had any success getting myself, or at least haven't had much success getting myself to do. So that can be things like, I want to work on my art more at night when I get home from work and whatever, or it can also fall under like, I want to take steps. I want to try and like put my stuff out there to people and I'm very nervous. So how do I get myself to do it more? Or how do I get myself to take that next step? It's one of the ways that comes in. The other way that it comes in is the way that I do therapy is primarily based around language. That everybody speaks their own language. And I'm using language here not just to mean the shared set of symbols that we use to communicate interpersonally, which is the more common definition. Like the English language is a set of shared symbols, a set of words that communally, collectively, those who speak English have some consensus on. This word is a symbol that represents this concept. This word is a symbol that represents this entity, whatever. The word cow means the thing that we mean by the word cow. But language, especially in therapy, we also need to talk about it as, or think about it as, the way that we communicate with ourselves. The way the symbols that we use to identify things, to label things. No, I'm rushing. Let me slow down here for a second. I was rushing because I thought of this as not being directly relevant to the art, but just kind of like some stuff I needed to put out there in order to explain how we're using the art. But in slowing down, I think this is relevant to the idea of using art. So what humans do, well, There are many, many things that humans do. One of the things that humans do is construct meaning. Meaning is connecting two different things in some way, right? If X means Y, what we're saying there is that we're taking the thing that X is and we're taking the thing that Y is, and we're creating some connection in our minds between those two things so that they're linked in some way. And sometimes that meaning, which is mostly what we're going to talk about here today, is a symbol which represents something. In the technical terms that you would use in linguistics, it depends on the school of thought that you come from, but I'm going to call these things the sign. The symbol is the sign. I put that over here. Symbol is the sign. The thing that it is pointing to is the signified, the thing which is signified. So the sign and the signified. So one version of constructing meaning is that we take a sign like a red octagon, about yay big, right? That's a sign. And we connect it to some idea, in this case, the idea of stopping your vehicle, making it so that it is no longer moving forward. And we create a connection there so that a big a big red octagon, when I see it, I am going to think I should stop my vehicle. That connection, making that connection, is called meaning. We make this meaning. Most meaning, well, I guess I shouldn't say most. A lot of meaning is given to us by people. Others will tell us, right? The example I just gave is one of those, where I did not come up with my own idea that a red octagon should represent the concept of stopping my vehicle. I was taught that a red octagon means you should stop your vehicle. And when we get these meanings taught to us, in those initial times when we're first learning it, it's very clumsy and awkward and difficult and resource intensive to explain the connection. But the idea of constructing meaning is that we do that. We go through the process of explaining the connection in this complicated, resource intensive way, because that creates meaning that allows us to communicate things more easily, more efficiently in the future. Teaching me at first that a red octagon means stop your car is tricky, but it's super useful because once we get that across, now all you have to do in order to get me to stop my car is put a red octagon up there. You don't have to tell me to stop you don't have to contact me directly and say, stop your car, or have a big sign that says, stop your car right now, or whatever, right? I know they say stop on it. That's part of the symbol. So that's how we construct interpersonal language, is that we share with each other these meanings. For any of you who have children or have worked with especially young children as they go through the process of developing and acquiring shared language, this explains so much of what you've experienced, right? That there are times where a kid, let me try and think of one that's recently happened. My middle son just asked me the other day what a certain word means, and I'm trying to remember what the word was that he asked. I can't remember. What's one that somebody's asked? The first thing that's popping in my head is that somebody recently asked me what demure means, but that wasn't my child, so it doesn't fall under the thing I was talking about when children are asking things. Imagine that a 3-year-old or a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old asks you say something like, oh, you're so brave. And they say, what does that mean? What does brave mean? And when you get asked that question, it's like, oh crap, how do I explain that concept in like different ways than to just use that sign? The whole point of having that sign of the word brave, which signifies this complicated concept, is so that I can signify this complicated concept. Without using that sign, it all of a sudden becomes really difficult. Oh, hi, Dad. Childlike. Yeah. My dad, who is here, is the one who asked me about demure the other day. So establishing, like sharing that language, creating a shared language is very resource intensive on the front end. You have to put a lot into trying to get this, make sure that we're going to be thinking of the same or similar thing when we both see this sign, or when I use this sign with you, or you use it with me. But the idea is that we're investing into being able to use that in the future to communicate with this person. When we're talking about our own internal personal language, some of the signs, some of the meaning is constructed in that way. It's shared with us, and we're trying to make these meanings that are the same as what other people use them as. They're never exactly the same, but we're trying to make them as close to being the same as we can. But we also have all these other signs that aren't necessarily shared symbols with a shared set of meaning, right? There are some things that I can be aware of, that I can think, that might appear to me when I think about it as a more of a visual thing than a word, or more of a feeling or a sensation than a word, or a smell, or it's still a sign. It is some abstract, like something that contains only a little bit of information, which signifies something else that has a lot more information. So this is when people are saying things like, I'm a visual thinker. It just means that the abstract signs that they're using in order to be able to interpret the world or remember things or predict what might happen in the future, that those contain elements that they identify as being more visual. I have a very specific idea in my head of what the word melancholy means, and it does not match up with the actual definition. So I will say in my own head, I'm feeling melancholy, but we'll have to catch myself and translate when talking to anyone else. Yeah, that's a lot of this comes into play with things like masking, but also just communication generally. I don't want to get too far off of the art stuff, and I want to make sure we keep going with that initial question, but people generally have this idea that words have a particular correct meaning. There are reasons that people generally believe that in our culture. Large part of that has to do with the dictionary, which is a thing that was invented in the 19th century by Daniel Webster. As far as I know, maybe there are other versions of this, but the version in my culture that I'm aware of is from Daniel Webster in the 19th century, and was specifically in order to try and prevent regional dialects from creeping, based on a theory that I think is a very sound one, that in order for a group of people to feel as though they belong to the same group as one another, one of the important parts of that is that they use symbols in the same way as one another. In other words, the simple version of it is, if you want a nation of people to all identify as being the same people, part of that means that they all have to speak the same language, or at least think as though they all speak the same language. And so it was a specific attempt to prevent what happens to language naturally, which is that, regional differences occur. And, if you look at the United Kingdom, which is predominantly English speaking, the drift, both in terms of what words mean what things, but also in the way that words are formed and spelled and how their sound is, compared to what's happened in the United States with English, is massive. Right? The entire United Kingdom is like, I don't know, the size of one of the probably smaller states in the United States. So there are still regional differences in the United States, but not anything compared to how much things change if you travel 20 miles or even less in the United Kingdom. See, I said I'm going to try not to get off on, and I went too far. Point is, this idea that we generally in our culture have, that words have a particular correct meaning, the dictionary definition is usually what we call that colloquially, is a relatively new idea. And it's not one that is used in linguistics. In the study of language, it is obvious and uncontroversial that language drifts and shifts and changes over time. Sorry, I only brought it up because we were talking about creating shorthand to describe things. To me, melancholy is a shorthand for sort of emotionally neutral, pensive stillness, but that's not what the word means for a lot of people. Sure. Although that's not far off what the word does mean for a lot of people also. But yes, an element of sadness is contained in that, as I'm sure you're aware, is contained in that for a lot of people. Anyway, this all does play into the art stuff, I promise. in a bunch of different ways, but I want to get back to that, so I'm not like dragging it out forever. What we're doing in therapy generally, what I'm doing, what in my approach to therapy, what I am doing and what the people that I train and support are attempting to do is to shift meanings for people that can be creating new meanings or connecting signs to new signifieds, connecting existing signs to new signifieds. I won't go down a whole list. It can take a lot of different forms, but getting advice or analysis or suggestions from your therapist, while beneficial when it is, sometimes it's beneficial, sometimes it's not, sometimes it actually is detrimental. That's an incidental thing. That's not, to me, that's not the point of therapy. The idea of a therapist as a person who is an expert on what people think and how we feel and how we act and what everything means is understandable. It's very core to what our culture generally talks about therapy as being. This idea that you go to the therapist, they tell you why you do the things or think the things or feel the things that you do, and they tell you what to do differently so that things change in the way that would be healthier. That's not really how it works. Although many therapists would say that is how it works. I'm just talking about my approach to this. I do often give specific suggestions or advice or whatever, but whether I have the ability to do that is pretty random. Like it's not possible for any person to know everything about everything, so that no matter what you're bringing to me, I somehow know the correct way to go about it or what potential solution there might be. That's not real. But there is plenty of stuff that I know about and can, getting information from you can make some suggestions. More frequently than that, I am an expert in communication and in a lot of these processes, and can help you to be able to get to solutions, either things that I do, questions I ask, and processes we engage in that help support you in figuring out ideas of what's worth trying next. And that also includes me making suggestions. But here to me is a big, important part of therapy. When you go to the mechanic, they don't just tell you how to fix your car and then you go away and do it. And if it doesn't work, you come back. When you go to the personal trainer, they don't just tell you how to exercise and you go away and you do it. They get involved and work on these things. And some of the things that they're doing are things that the whole point of going to them is that you don't know about them. You don't need to know about them or know how to implement them. What we can do as therapists there is the same as what every conversation with every person does. Every experience changes you in some way, right? New information, sometimes things change the way their body is, the way that you think, the way that whatever. And for the most part, we could say if we isolated any specific, 5 minutes of time, the vast majority of that is going to be such small changes that we wouldn't even notice them or really generally categorize them as changes, even though there are always, if nothing else, some cells in your body die in a moment and new cells are created, right? There's always at least some. But for the most part, the way that our lives work is that there are specific moments that are really impactful, and most moments are not very impactful at all. But every conversation with a person changes you, partly by the mechanism we're talking about here, which is this meaning-making thing. If, for example, someone here thinks, man, I procrastinated a lot. Well, at some point, somewhere back down the line, somebody had a conversation with you, or you heard somebody saying something or read something. Somebody communicated to you the word procrastinate and what that word means, and what it means if what you're doing is something that could be identified as procrastinating, and whether that's good or bad, and what are some theories about why someone would do that. What are some implications about if you are a person who procrastinates in a certain way or at a certain frequency, what might that mean about your future, or what might that mean is also true about you in other ways. All of this stuff is meaning that gets created over the years. We know that because you're using the word procrastinate, which is not a word you made up. And you're using it, even if the way you're using it and what it means to you isn't exactly the same as what it means to somebody else, even if it's different than what it means to most people in some way, you're still using it in a way that is intended to or related to the way other people use it. You can't have just coincidentally, randomly come to your own conclusion about this, because the chances that you would randomly create the same word out of thin air that means a similar concept is basically nothing. So when I say every conversation changes you, that's what I mean. That most likely the conversation or the interaction where you first got the word procrastinate, and then the several interactions since then that have added on different connotations about what it means and whether it's good or bad and whatever. Most likely those conversations weren't ones where the person was explicitly trying to say to you, let me teach you about this concept called procrastination, right? Likely the first time you ever heard that word was somebody who's saying like, I'm procrastinating. I got to stop procrastinating on the thing. And you had no idea what it meant, but it piqued your curiosity, or you connected it to something you saw them doing or whatever. So every conversation changes you. Our job as therapists, my job as a therapist, is to do the best that I am able to do to make it so that our conversations change you in line with the changes you want to happen. My role as a therapist is to help a person close the gap between what their life is and what they would want it to be. That if you're coming to therapy, there's something going on in your life, in the way that you think, the way that you feel, the way that you behave, what's happening in your environment and in your experiences. There's something, usually a lot of things, that are different than you would want them to be. So my job as a therapist then is to first identify what are the differences, what are the things that you would like to be different than they are, and then to do everything that I can to make it so that your life and what you want your life to be come as close together as possible. And sometimes that is about changing things so that what's happening in your life is different and it becomes more like what you'd want it to be, right? You're depressed. You're experiencing a certain set of experiences that collectively we label that as being depressed, and you don't want to be depressed anymore. And we work on changing how you're experiencing things and the frequency and the duration and the intensity and the impact of those things, such that now what you're feeling matches what you would want to be feeling. Sometimes it's that. Sometimes it's the other thing, where we're working on changing what you would want your life to be, your ideas of what you want your life to be, or what is possible to come more in line with what your life already is. Sometimes we're changing a third thing, which is how you perceive what's going on, so that even though the reality of what's changing or of what's happening doesn't change and what you want doesn't change, you're now seeing what is already happening as being more in line with what you would want to happen. Anyway, including in these conversations right now, what I'm doing at all times is I'm doing my best to use language in such a way, to communicate with you in such a way. And by language, I don't just mean words. I mean all signs that signify things. We call things body language, for example, right? Like that a movement of an eyebrow can signify a thing to a person. Words are the most precise version of language, not 100% precise, but we can have a lot more precision because words are much more modular. They can be modified more easily. We can have a lot more precision with words than we can with body language or other things, but all these things are language. I have put thought and effort and resources into what it is that you see on this screen behind me, and what I'm wearing on my wrist and my finger and my, the shirt and the logo in the corner, all these things. I'm trying to communicate in such a way that our interaction changes you so that your life moving forward now is more what you'd want it to be. That's the base idea. On top of that, if I can give you suggestions or thoughts or exercises or things that I think might continue to help you, I'm also working on trying to do that to the best of my ability, but that is bonus, right? There are times where I don't have a thought or a suggestion or an exercise or an analysis or whatever that's going to be helpful. So now we come back to art. Because all of this, for me, the question was about how I use art. All of this falls into that category. Art is particular versions of meaning making, right? That I would venture to guess that pretty much everybody, certainly everybody who identifies art as being in some way important or meaningful has had at least one experience in their life where they have experienced some art. You saw some visual art, you observed a performance, you heard music, whatever, ate some food, which I also think can be a version of art. Not all cooking is art, but some of it is. You had some experience of art where that experience is not something that you can put into words. You couldn't put it into words at the time, even for yourself. And certainly after the fact, you can try, and you certainly can do your best to kind of get at the idea, the suggestion, whatever, the direction of that experience, but you don't feel satisfied even internally in being able to fully put what that experience was into language. So the experience in and of itself is its own sign now, right? That experience, whatever version of it was encoded in your memory, conveys meaning to you in a way that you cannot then distribute that meaning to some other piece of language. That felt inaccessible to me, that way of phrasing that. Let me think. There are some pieces of art that this isn't about whether this is true or accurate, this is about what I think, right? There are some pieces of art that I feel confident I can describe to you in a way where, like, once I'm done with that description, I think I got it all across to you. Like, everything that mattered about that, I conveyed. There are some pieces of art where I can't. No matter how much I try, I can get some parts, and the more I try, the more I can get across to you about what about that art was meaningful or beneficial or important or whatever. But I will never feel satisfied about, or at least I thus far have not ever felt satisfied about being able to say, like, yep, I got it all across. There's always that, like, there's more, but I don't know how to do it. And the best art for me, my favorite experiences of art are when that's how I feel even by myself. That even when I think about my experience of that art, I'm like, I'm not quite like getting it all across to myself. There's pieces I can't quite encapsulate. In that first scenario, where I can put it all into words and feel confident that I have gotten the point across, I don't need to, I have no incentive to spend my unconsidered cognitive processes, have no incentive to spend resources to remember that art, other than remembering the words that I think encapsulate the art. If I can take the meaning of that experience and capture it all by saying, is a really fun, cool action movie. If to me, again, this isn't about whether it's true, other people have different opinions. If to me saying that was a fun, cool action movie contains all the information that is relevant about that movie, then that's all I need to remember, is that it was a fun, cool action movie. I don't need to remember any other part of it. But if to me, trying to describe it in all kinds of words still doesn't get it, then these processes now are incentivized to spend resources encoding the art into my memory, the experience into my memory in a non-word based way. So it can be very meaningful and changing experiences. But ultimately, art is about meaning. The whole point of any form of art that I'm aware of anyway, but if there was any art form that didn't meet this criteria, then we'd be having a different conversation about what I mean by art. Because by my definition of art, the whole point of it is that it's symbolic representation. That the art, the thing, the piece that you are observing or interacting with is connected to, means some other complicated stuff. Sometimes that's ideas and plots and characters, and sometimes that's just emotions and sensations and whatever. So when I'm doing therapy, the very first thing that's the highest priority for me is to acquire as much language as possible from the client. I'm trying to learn at first. There's three things I'm doing, and it shifts over time. I'm trying to acquire language from the client. I'm trying to learn the language that you already speak. We collectively, the two of us together, are going to co-construct some language together that allows us to communicate with each other more efficiently and effectively, but also that then encodes into each of us personally and dictates how we view things and think about things and feel about things. And sometimes I'm going to be teaching you my language. So I'm acquiring yours, we're constructing some together, and I'm teaching you mine. The earlier in the process, the more I'm going to be focused on acquiring your language, learning your language. Teaching you my language is always going to be a very sparse thing. Well, no, let me say that differently. Teaching the client my language will come up in one of two ways. One is I'm trying to communicate something and did not identify in advance that some piece of language I'm using to communicate that thing might not be connected clearly to the same meanings for the client that I'm predicting that it would be. And they can, in other words, I say something that doesn't make sense or gets interpreted differently than I thought it would be interpreted. And that's a miscommunication, and we identify the miscommunication, and now I'm teaching what I meant as a way to repair that miscommunication so that we can get back on the same page and have a stronger ability to communicate moving forward, because now we have a better understanding of one another. The other way that I'll teach my language is when I'm doing some specific, like I have identified that I think it would be helpful to you if you had this sign connected to this signified, and I have a piece of language that I use for this sign to connect to this signified. And so I'm trying to make this connection, just like anybody else teaching language. That part I use rarely. Because more effective is to do the co-constructing language, where you and I together, you're not just receiving this language from me, but you and I together are coming up with making a connection between this sign and this thing that is signified. I think symbolic is one important aspect of artistic expression, one that I tend to lean towards, but not the only aspect. Oh, certainly not the only aspect, for sure. But what I would say is that all art is symbolic in the way I'm talking about it right now. Meaning, so there's a famous painting called, and I don't remember the French, because it's actually titled in French, but the English translation is "This is not a pipe." I think it's Rene Magritte. I could be wrong about these things. And it's a painting, a fairly realistic looking painting of a pipe, of a tobacco pipe. I was going to say meerschaum pipe, but I don't actually know what meerschaum means, but pipe with the bowl, like Sherlock Holmes would use. See, without language, how difficult it is to communicate. We have to use other signs, and anyway, which I love. To me, I love that piece. If it didn't have that title, or if I wasn't aware of that title, then I probably would not give a crap about it, right? I would just see it as a painting of a pipe and maybe look at like the artistic skill or the technical skill involved in like making that visual. But the meaning that it conveys for me is about the title of the piece. This is not a pipe. Because to me, what it means, and I believe this is what the artist was intending to convey, but I don't know, and I never will and never can. To me, the meaning that I get out of it is that at first you see the image, and because of the way that human cognition works, you match what you see. You match not just what you see, but what you observe through the various senses. You match aspects of that, elements of what you're observing, against what is called a perceptual set. We have these things that we call perceptual sets, which is a map, effectively, right? That like, if something looks like X and has Y and blah, 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 meets all, if something has 4 legs and is furry and it barks and its snout is shaped kind of like this, then it is a dog. And so when we're observing something, we just look to match all that stuff. We're just getting the minimum information we need about a thing to match it against one of our, we have like a whole library, a database of perceptual sets. And we're matching it against that. And now we say, okay, I know what this is. And we don't take in additional information. So you see that first and you think that's a pipe. Now, if anyone were to ask you, is that a pipe? At first you'd say, yeah, it's a pipe. But if anyone was more clear and explicit about like, is that thing that you're looking at, can it be used in the way that you use a pipe? Would you interact with it in the way that you use a pipe? Then of course, no, right? You can't actually put tobacco in it and smoke it. So then you'd say, okay, yes, it's not a pipe, it's a picture of a pipe. It's an illustration or a drawing, a representation of a pipe. For me, it goes beyond that, this particular piece, and maybe it's worth getting into more specific stuff, but I think that's enough to get the point across, which is just, I think that part of what's coming across with the title is reminding people that you're looking at a symbol. What you're experiencing is something which is an abstract representation of something else. Even if it's a photorealistic, like looks exactly like it, it isn't it, right? It's still a painting of it. It's a dance which evokes the feeling or represents the feeling. It is not the feeling itself, right? Art, by definition, is not, again, other people could use the term differently and we could debate like particular meanings, but what we're talking about generally, art is not the thing that it's intended to represent or convey or evoke for people. It is the thing which is meant to evoke the thing or represent the thing or elicit the thing or prompt the thought or whatever. Maybe I'm getting too complicated, but I don't know. In the same way that if I say cow, that word cow, that I'm just making sounds. I'm causing the air to vibrate by vibrating parts of my body against other parts of my body and then bouncing those vibrations off particular shapes of other parts of my body so that the air vibrates in a particular way coming out. And then in this case, hits a microphone, which translates it into stuff that then creates vibrations in the air on your side, hits your ear, and then it gets translated to me what it means. The word cow is not a cow. It's a sign that points at a cow, right? It's a sign that signifies the thing which is signified, which is the thing we think of when a cow. One of you were saying earlier about translating things in your head, and this is an important point about language. The word cow means nothing to someone who doesn't speak English, right? If you speak Spanish and I say vaca, it means the same thing. It evokes the same concept as the English word cow. If you don't speak Spanish, when I say vaca, it evokes nothing. So that's part of what I'm saying about these meanings have to be constructed. And when we're communicating to somebody else, as was mentioned before, we're not usually aware of this, but we are always doing this thing where we're trying to make our guesses about how another person will interpret what we're saying. For example, if I'm interacting with somebody that I am aware, I believe does not speak any English, then I'm not going to really try to communicate things to them using English words. And nobody really would, right? Or if you did, you'd still be trying to communicate it in some other way while saying that. Sorry, I think there might be a typo in that one. Listen to a telenovela. Not 100%, but close enough. The Socrates bed metaphor. I'm not sure what the Socrates bed metaphor is, actually. I'd be curious to know. So let me use an example that's more relevant to therapy specifically. Here's something that every single person experiences. You hear voices in your head, right? Now, this is a language thing. Because certainly some people would say, no, I don't hear voices in my head. And some people would say, yes, I do hear voices in my head. In the same way, some people will say, yes, I see images in my head. And others will say, no, I don't see images. In either case, whatever is happening in your cognitive space is not actually a sound or a visual, because visual information we get through our eyes and auditory information we get through our ears. There's other stuff too, but just to simplify, what you're aware of in your mind's eye, this is part of what I'm talking about, what are you aware of in your cognitive space, your working memory, consciousness, awareness, whatever you want to call it, is a symbol that you identify as having or sharing some aspects of visual data or auditory data, right? But generally, if I were to say to somebody, like, when you read a book, do you ever hear the character's voice speaking in your head? When you read a book, do you visualize what the characters might look like or what the setting looks like? Generally, people are going to say, yeah. Or if I say, pick a memory of a conversation you just had, something that somebody said to you that really stuck with you, and pull that memory up. Do you like hear that person saying that thing in your head or see that person in your mind? Generally, people are going to say yes. So if we all experience something like that, then it becomes very important what people teach you about that. If you learn, whether other people are intentionally trying to teach this to you or not, if you learn that people are not supposed to experience things in that way and that other people don't experience things in that way, then you're going to be understandably very concerned about the fact that you are experiencing something in your mind that, to your understanding, nobody else experiences or nobody else is supposed to experience. It's in some way bad, unhealthy, insane, whatever. If we take something and we connect it to, if we create meaning, mostly so far we've been talking about meaning between like a symbol and what it signifies, a sign and a signified. But other versions of meaning are about connecting different concepts to other things, right? So if we take something like, let's make it more simple. You're nauseous. You feel nausea. That's an inherently unpleasant thing. You don't like it. You want it to go away. If we connect that to, well, when a person feels nauseous, if what your thought is when a person feels nauseous, it means that they ate something that isn't sitting right with them and they just need to wait for a couple hours and then the nausea will go away. If that's what you think, then when you feel nausea, you will be annoyed and you won't like it, but you'll also say, it'll go away in a couple hours. I just ate something that didn't sit right with me, right? If instead you are convinced for whatever reason that when a person feels nausea, it means they have cancer, which means they are likely to die. Then when you feel nausea, now you're going to be very concerned. You're not going to sit and say, well, this is annoying, but it'll go away in a couple hours. You're going to panic and call your doctor or go to the hospital, start getting tests done to see if you have cancer. In either case, the way that you're acting, what you think and what you feel and what you do is a logical response, a reasonable response to what it is that you believe is happening. So when it comes to therapy, I'm going to say, just to be cautious, I'm going to say so much of what we're doing in therapy has to do with the connections that have been made for people about what means what. That if I feel this kind of a way, that means I am constructed in such a way, which is, here's a super common one. If I attempt to do something and I fail at it, that indicates to me that whatever is true about a person which makes them likely to fail at this thing is true about me. So if I attempt a thing and I fail at it, that means that I'm a person who fails at this kinds of thing, which means that any future attempts at the same kind of thing will likely also result in failure, or at least makes it seem more likely to me that I will continue to fail at this thing. So an individual attempt with an individual failure then turns into, oh no, I can't do this, or I'm a bad person. That's not how it works. That's in fact the exact opposite of how it works, right? If you're trying to learn to shoot a free throw, you're going to miss at first. That doesn't mean that you're a person who misses free throws. It means it's a skill you haven't developed, and the more that you practice, the better you'll get at it. But that's just one specific category that a lot of stuff that comes up in therapy can fall under, that I did this thing or was exposed to this thing or had this resulted in this unpleasant thing that I didn't want. And now I'm generalizing that to mean that I will always have this, or I'm likely to have this, or there's something wrong about me or how I'm constructed so that that enabled me or caused me to have this unpleasant experience, instead of looking at the specifics of what happened. Oh, that's about the bet. I'll look at that in a second because I got to get wrapping up soon, unfortunately. So back to art. When someone expresses that they have a particular interest in art, I am acquiring that as language, right? If, for example, you tell me about that you're big into film, then I'm going to shift into using film metaphors or talking about directors. And some of that is like things I already know, right? Like if you tell me that you're big into video games, I can start using language and metaphors and references that I know of from video games that I have some level of confidence that you might also know about based on whatever I'm guessing about you, right? Like if you tell me that you are big into World of Warcraft, which I know at this point is, even though it's still a modern game, a pretty outdated reference because it's not very popular, or at least relatively. But it's the first thing that came to my mind. If you tell me that you're big into World of Warcraft, then I know that I can use terms like tanking and DPS and, in order to communicate something to you. So that's part of it. Another part of it is that if you tell me you're into a particular art form, just like any other thing that you're interested in, I can ask questions and get more information from you to build language better. You tell me you're into film, and I can say, oh yeah, like what kind of stuff? Like what genre in particular are you interested in? What directors do you like? Tell me a bit about this, a bit about that, and I can acquire that language to use. So the two ways in which we'll utilize that art then, one is, like I was saying before, if that particular thing is something you want to change, we're going to bring it in as something that we're working on. If you want to engage with, you want to work on making your art more frequently, right? A very common thing for clients of mine is, I'm not writing music as much as I want to be. Then we'll bring music into what we're doing as part of trying to make it so that you then are working on your music more in the way that you would want to be. And we're creating some of those experiences here. Honestly, sometimes the way that I'll incorporate art, in one particular version of incorporating art into therapy, is just having my clients share with me whatever art they're creating. I'm listening to their song. I have a piece of art on my wall, visual art on my wall that a client made, reading their poems or whatever. Sometimes to give feedback because that's what's wanted. Sometimes just because having a person read it makes it more meaningful or makes you feel better or makes it more interesting or easier for you to continue to work on or whatever. Other times we'll be doing exercises together that I am identifying as I think it will be helpful in a broader way, but also helpful in the specific way of if someone comes into me and they're super into golf, I'm just picking a random example and gliding over a lot. There are contexts in which I could see myself getting to the point of saying, like, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go to the driving range and I want you to deliberately hit 20 balls in a row terribly, like on purpose, hit them as bad as you can hit them without being unsafe to yourself or others, right? So some version of that I can do with art. The difference with a lot of versions of art, not all, but a lot of versions of art, is that it's something we can do in session together, right? I want you to deliberately sing that song that you're worried about singing, but I want you to deliberately sing it off key and poorly. I want you to, is one thing I could get somebody to do if I can all the details, because I do got to get wrapping up. All of these would depend on the context. The second way that I would be using it is about using it as part of a language to get to some other thing. When I work with people who are computer programmers, software coders, I'll frequently use, in trying to help them understand how the mind works or how they're interpreting something, I'll reference like, so this is basically like RAM, and this is like, it's like if you could open up the code and look at the code underneath the program instead of just the user interface or whatever. We can do the same with music. Rubber duck reference all the time. Yeah, I use rubber duck deprogramming relatively frequently. And in particular, this is why I talk so much about creating meaning and shifting meaning, whatever. in particular, if someone is big into a particular form of art, that indicates, it doesn't prove necessarily, but it indicates that it is quite likely that that medium, that way of communicating information and constructing meaning is a powerful and effective one for them specifically. So if what I'm trying to do is help you to connect this new word to this new concept, then I might structure it so that we're doing an exercise where here's a specific one that I've used in the past is I want you to just take a moment. I don't want you to think about it too deeply or anything, because I want it to be just kind of what first comes to you. And we have a piece of blank paper in front of you and some markers, different color markers for you to use. I want you to imagine that 6 months from now, that between now and 6 months from now, everything goes exactly as you would want it to go, right? Today is October 14th. So we're talking about October, November, December, January, February, March, April. We're talking about April 14th, 2025. And I'm going to have you take a look at what that day looks like for you. But imagine that starting right now, everything breaks exactly as you would want it to break. You make whatever changes you want to make. It can only be changes that can be made in 6 months, right? But externally, the environment, whatever other things that are out of your control still go exactly the way you would want it to for the next 6 months. So 6 months from now, your life is as close to what you would want it to be as possible. I want you to think about that day. Start with waking up, right? You wake up, take a look around. Where are you? What is your bed like? What is the sheets and the blankets and the pillow like? What is the light like? Where is it coming from? How did you wake up? Was it an alarm? Did you wake up on your own? What time is it? And so on and on. Paint a picture to evoke a lot. And then say, okay, now pick some moment from that day, one particular moment, whatever it is. Just think through that day in that level of detail. Pick one moment and freeze that snapshot in time. And I want you to draw that on the paper in front of you to the best of your ability. Remember, it's symbolic representation. This isn't about being photorealistic or accurate. This isn't about good art or bad art. This is just about representing that in a way that for you works to represent that on paper in front of you. I'm running out of time. I'm past 2:00. And then once that happens, we can take that and do things with it. This particular exercise, I had them go to the next page and walk them through a different but similar exercise, but change some of the context. And then we can compare the two different images and we can talk about things and whatever. That's an exercise I've used with people. I've only used it with people that I think of or who identify as being interested in visual art. For other people, I use different versions. People who are writers, I can do a similar exercise, but in writing it down. But I use it sometimes, that particular exercise is when someone is talking about having some general idea or goal about what they want to be different and are struggling to be specific about whatever that might be, right? If people say, I just want to be happier, which is great. And everybody by definition wants to be happier, even if you're happy, being happier would still be better. But in order to make changes, we have to be able to identify observable things that we can in some way influence or impact or control. And so that's a way to translate the vague concept of being happier 6 months from now into some specific details that we can then kind of reverse engineer. So one of the things that would be better if everything was how you wanted it to be is that you'd be able to wake up later in the day than you're currently waking up, or wake up without an alarm clock, or you'd be living in a different place, or you would be sleeping different. And I'm just referencing things from the waking up moment, right? So that's a particular example where what we're looking at is we're trying to other thing than the art itself, but we're using art as a way to kind of create that new meaning, because it's like trying to create new meaning for someone who speaks English by speaking English is a lot more likely to work than trying to create new meaning for someone who speaks English by speaking Spanish. Trying to help someone create new meanings that paints is a lot more likely to be effective if you utilize that painting than if you try to do it by having them write a song about it, if that makes sense. We didn't have time to get to the other thing too much, although I touched on a lot of like the elements of it and the underpinning of it. We can talk more about it next time. But the other thing about how I utilize it in all stuff, but it comes down to meaning making. That's what we're looking at. That's what I'm utilizing, is I'm looking at narratives and offering new narratives and reframing and constructing things and accessing archetypes and utilizing tropes and etc. Because for what it's worth, myself as an artist, my undergraduate degree was in acting. So if I had to identify like by outside markers of credibility, what's my chief way of engaging with art would be acting. Really though, I'm a writer. I've always thought of myself as a writer. I've always wanted to be a writer. When I had to do those exercises in 6th grade and 7th grade and whatever about what do you want to be when you grow up and research that profession, it was always a writer. I've written plays and poems, and I have started and not gotten very far into several different novels. But whether it's that, I'm also a musician. I play guitar and I sing. Singing certainly was part of the acting career stuff also, but I write music, or at least I used to. It's been a while since I've written music, but I used to write music a lot. But to me, what I really think of as like my chief, I don't know, whatever. The expression is different, but what I do is I'm a storyteller. That's what I like. I like to tell stories. And while I totally understand and very much respect when people are talking about like a visual image can tell a story in and of itself, and I do believe that, my version of storytelling is much more language based, whether that's acting or writing or songs. It's about the language I'm using and the narrative I'm constructing and the experience I'm trying to evoke that way. So that's how I use my art in my sessions, is that to me, I'm not going to say all of this, but a lot of this is some version of storytelling. We're living out stories. No, I shouldn't say it that way. What I mean is a lot of the things that we think and feel and do and experience in our lives happen the way they happen because of the stories that we have. And if we change those stories or add new ones or clarify or specify certain parts or connect certain parts to other things, then what we think and what we feel and what we do and how we experience things changes. That if I walk through a garden full of flowers, I see a garden full of flowers, and the experience of it can be beautiful and memorable and affecting for me. But after the fact, if you ask me about what I saw, I'll tell you it's a bunch of flowers. And if you say, like what kinds of flowers, I can't tell you because I don't know. But if I know 20 different kinds of flowers and how to identify them, then I can walk through that same garden. And after the fact, if you ask me about what I just experienced, I can tell you, well, I saw 2 of these and 3 of these, and there was a grouping of purple versions of this over here. And I remember it with much more detail. And what we notice, what we remember, the meanings we connect things to, all of this is gated through language and narrative. That if the story you have is that the most important thing is, here's a very common one. Story doesn't mean fiction. It just means I'm using it to mean like an understanding of how things play into one another or affect one another. A lot of the time in sequence, like chronologically, but not necessarily. But if the story that you have is that people by default are happy and energized and excited and relaxed, and that feeling any other kind of a way than that, feeling sad or scared or angry, is an unnatural response or something that is possible for people to avoid, or that should be viewed with suspicion as though it is an indication that there's something wrong with you, then whenever you feel those things, you're going to have this secondary thing of like, oh no, what's wrong with me that I'm feeling this way? if the story that you have is that humans feel all kinds of things and all of them are ones that you're supposed to feel and have to feel, and that it isn't possible to avoid feeling any of them categorically, but that doesn't mean that you should just feel how you feel and there's nothing to do about it and you shouldn't want to do anything about it, that it's okay to want to feel different things, and it is possible to look at and explore and make changes that make it so that you feel things different than how you feel them. But how you feel is a response to the things that are happening around you, as filtered through your perception and your storytelling and all that kind of stuff. Then how you feel angry, and then afterwards what you think and what you feel and what you do is very different if that's the story you have than if the story you have is that getting angry is a sign of weak moral character. I have to go. I want to talk more about this, but we're way past 2 and I got to get going. I hope that addressed, I believe that it addressed at least some part of what you were asking. I don't know how much of it, and maybe there's other parts, and please come back and ask more specifics, because also I'm only talking about myself and different therapists that I know both here at Effective Artistry, but also different therapists that I know elsewhere use art differently, and I can try to give more of a sense of what I'm aware of people using art instead of just how I use it, or any other versions of this question. I'll be here again next week, next Monday, 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Central Time. I appreciate so much all of you being here and participating in the chat. Thank you. It's good to be with you all. I hope you all have a good week, and I will see you next week if I do, and if not, be well. Thank you. Trying to end the stream, but it's playing that game with me where, oh,